Hello, I'm going to talk about dietary guidelines today. What are they? Are they effective? Do they work? Dietary guidelines are established by the United States Department of Agriculture, and it's basically a set of recommendations that the American public can follow to enhance their health. They're revised every 5 years. And so the most recent right now, I'm in the year of 2025. They just came out with a scientific report and they're going to revise the guidelines in the next, hopefully, few months here. And then we'll have dietary guidelines from 2025 to 2030. From 2020 to 2025, the biggest theme came called Make Every Bite Count, and they still use the My Plate for the food groups, and they really emphasized healthy dietary patterns at every stage, limiting beverages with added sugars, saturated fat, sodium, or alcohol, and focus on nutrient-dense foods and staying within your calorie limits. The interesting part from 2025 is they were just trying to understand how can we start to have a conversation on ultra-processed foods. The hardest part about this in research is there's no definition that is decided in the United States what that means, and they're having a hard time defining that because there isn't much research outside within the United States that defines that. There is a classification called the NOVA classification out of Brazil that looks at how food is processed. That can be used, that's pretty common, but we don't have much research on health outcomes. So what happens is this scientific advisory committee from the Human and Health Services and the USDA, they get together and they look at the research and they say, do we have enough to make a stance on ultra-processed foods as a USDA, as a nation, and is it linked to health outcomes? You would assume that we would, and you would assume that there would be enough information, and there's a lot of politics that go into the recommendations of dietary guidelines, which is sad to say. If you really like talking about this, Marion Nestle is a really good resource that has a lot of information on this, and there's a lot of political and lobbyist influences that go into the dietary guidelines, especially now in our political culture. And so the words matter in these dietary guidelines to the lobbyist of these big companies. And so saying reduced added sugar could potentially affect profits. And so instead of that, it's limiting foods with beverages with added sugar. And so if we potentially start to say eat less ultra-processed foods, investments and companies are worried about the dip in profits. And so it becomes really difficult on how to advise the dietary guidelines. And this is where people get really angry about the food industry and how that's affecting our health. At the end of the day, you have the ability to choose your foods. It is hard in an obesogenic environment where we have foods. 70% of our food supply is ultra processed. That removes the fiber, that removes the protein. So as a consumer, it's being aware of these things, but also understanding that these foods aren't going to harm you. They aren't going to kill you. Those are very strong words. The exposure of these foods over time, limiting your fiber and limiting your protein, can affect health outcomes, or it can increase your risk for certain diseases. And you want to make sure that your languaging doesn't induce fear, or it doesn't cause any sort of language where it induces morality that you are a bad person if you eat these foods. And so the languaging is really, really important. And being a dietitian for 20 years, you want to make sure that you are encouraging fiber intake and protein intake from whole foods, and understanding SDS markers, where if you can't afford these things, doing the best you can with frozen or canned. But if you don't have access to these foods, sometimes your ultra-processed foods are doing the best you can. And as a country, we're wanting to increase access to fibrous foods for all people. So the dietary guidelines will be interesting to see what they come up with and if they've changed since 2025. From my understanding, they probably won't change much, and we're needing to do more research so we can justify the needing of changing the words, so people understand that we need, as a country, to increase more fiber and more protein. I hope this helps. And if you understand this and want to like and follow along, hit subscribe. Okay, thanks, bye.